Welcome back! My name is Baller Scuba. This is Video Games Over Time. We are still in 1983. Today we're going to look back in 1983 in a retrospective. If you haven't seen one of these videos before, it's kind of my chance to just kind of talk to camera without a script. I have notes in front of me. This time they're all on my phone. And we're just going to kind of take things at a little bit more leisurely pace and kind of just talk about things as a whole. These videos always tend to go long, so let's just kind of get into it. We'll start with some behind-the-scenes stuff that's been going on kind of in my personal life. At some point, I would like to make a video about this because it's kind of been a lot, but I'll just kind of give you some brief things here. I had to get a new job. My old job, I probably shouldn't talk too much about it, but let's just say it became a place that I did not want to be anymore, and I was not the only employee to feel that way. So I got out and I got a new job. I am now working at a full-on CPA firm as an accounting specialist is what they call me. And so that is good. It's a better job. It is an improvement for me. But with that said, it is further away from home. And so me getting home, especially on Fridays, to try to record is something that has become too difficult, so I have postponed streaming. My kind of plan for that is to try to get my own business going. I did actually start that. I'm going to do accounting services for businesses, basically. And if that picks up and I can do more of the work for myself directly, then there is a good chance that I will not need to work, 45 minutes away for 40 hours a week, and maybe I can get back to streaming. That is the long-term goal, but right now I do have to stop streaming simply because of the time constraints. I basically feel like I have 12-hour days. Because, basically I wake up at 6 a.m. and I don't get home till 6 p.m. And I'm not doing anything other than work in that time. So streaming at the end is probably not going to be good because I don't have a lot of energy. And it takes energy for me to be entertaining from time to time. So we'll postpone that for now. I hope to get back to it should my business kind of take off and I can start doing that from home. Or maybe I can work hybrid or remote for the CPA firm. We'll see what happens in the long run. But for now, not much. I should mention, before I mentioned a construction lawsuit that was going on that has officially been not necessarily resolved, but it's been decided. I have a piece of paper basically from a judge saying, yes, this company owes you the money that you claim. And so now it's just a matter of me getting it from the company, which the court does not help with. But that is technically over. I can talk about it a little bit more now since there's not a pending lawsuit. But essentially, I hired them to do some repair work in our kitchen due to water damage, and they damaged my property. So I sued them because they were not willing to admit that when they moved the fridge, they dented it, or that they put a hole in our wall, or that they left the contents of our kitchen freezer on the kitchen floor, or that they sprayed dust literally everywhere on our first floor, including in the cabinets and drawers. So yeah, they owed me money because they weren't willing to fix that or really talk to me about it. So yeah, I'll see if I can get the money back, but I can talk about that more in detail. Like I said, I kind of want to make its own video for this, but I've kind of wanted to do that for a while. We'll see if I can get some time for that. In much better news, Han and I went to England for a vacation. It was for Han's 30th birthday, and it was a lot of fun. We had a great time there. Maybe you doing all right? Okay, so we went to London, we went to Oxford, we went to, where else we go? We went to York and we went to Brighton. So we kind of got a little bit of a tour of the whole island, at least a little bit. We didn't, well, I mean, as best as we could in like 10 days. But we had a lot of fun. York was especially nice. I really did enjoy that, even though while I was there, people were like, why are you in York? And I'm like, this was the best part of our trip. What are you talking about? And my dog is just kind of roaming around. She's got a lot of energy this morning, and I'm not sure why. But the London trip, well, the England trip, did actually impact video games a bit. Because I did go to a video game store and I actually bought a game there. It's a Rare game, not the company, but it's actually Rare. We'll talk about Rare later. But it is a game that I'd never seen before. It's not a British game. It's actually a Japanese game. They just happened to have it in York. So I went and bought it, and I'll talk about that at some point, probably in the personal video, because it's a game from after where we are now. So I'll eventually kind of bring that up. You might notice some things are gone here. I just kind of looked behind me a bit. But anyway, we'll move on to the videos that I created this year. We'll talk a little bit more about those, a little bit about the behind the scenes of those, and a little bit about kind of my personal experience with them. We'll start with the video game Crash of 1983. That was our first video. Like I had mentioned before, I had heard a lot about the video game Crash of 1983, and I'd heard a lot of differing opinions on it. Some people say that it basically pushed the video game industry into bankruptcy, and that the video game industry had to be saved, and that it was thanks to the work of one particular company that it was able to come back at all. All right, she positioned herself at the window. She's just going to look for a bit, hopefully. Yeah, no growling or barking, okay? We're recording. She usually doesn't have this much energy when I record. But that was one side of the video game Crash of 1983 that I heard, was basically it was devastating and the entire industry was on the brink of never coming back. And I've heard from the other side that, it wasn't that big of a deal. It was basically just one company, and even they were fine on the other side, right? So I've heard both sides of that for a long time, so I wanted to get into it a little bit more and kind of come up with an opinion myself. The big thing that I learned about this time is that it's not, 1983 alone. And that's why there's going to be a lot of differing opinions, is because it impacts different industries differently. The arcade industry doesn't have the same timeline as the 2600 industry, which is different than what the Japanese computer industry is going through and the British computer industry is going through. So we'll kind of keep track of it as we keep going. We're not done with the video game Crash in 1983. It actually lasts a couple years. So we'll talk about that as we continue, just kind of behind the scenes. From now on, it's never going to be front and center in its own video again, but we'll talk about kind of that kind of thing in honorable mention videos and kind of in the background of some of the other stuff that we're talking about. All right, so moving on to our next video, which is Mappy. Mappy is a game that I have heard a lot about, but never got a chance to play myself. Most of what I heard about Mappy is from a later title that we will eventually get into. It's kind of a franchise, so we'll talk about that title when we get to it. Honestly, I don't remember too much about Mappy. I remember it kind of being weird. It is a scrolling platform game, though, and that is something that we had not seen too much of. And that's kind of influential, right? To have something that scrolls. That's not something that happens all the time in the games that we're playing right now. So that's kind of a big deal, but at the same time, it was kind of weird the way that it ended up. There's a lot of rule sets to that I don't fully understand why they exist that way. The fact that you can jump in the trampoline and nobody can touch you, but as soon as you land, then you're screwed. I don't understand. But yeah, I enjoyed that game. Mario Brothers. Of course, I have played Mario Brothers before the original Mario Brothers. It is a game that I don't particularly enjoy all that much. I see why people like it, but it's not necessarily my favorite. It has a lot of stuff that I really do enjoy in later titles, but in this one it just didn't kind of all mesh together for me. But of course, hugely influential. We're going to need to track pretty much everything Mario, so that makes sense why we ended up talking about it. Spoilers, there's going to be more things with Mario, but if you didn't catch that already, then you probably haven't been paying attention. They've already kind of made Mario a bit of a major figure in the Nintendo universe, so to speak. In the Nintendo company catalog, they're just focusing on Donkey Kong and Mario, so that is going to be something we pay attention to. Next up, we have the Star Wars arcade game. Now, this one's an interesting one for me because I never actually played the original before. The original one is fun, don't get me wrong, but I actually played what I would consider an enhanced remake of that came out in the 90s, and hopefully we get to that one because that's actually a good arcade game that I loved, and I hope that it turned out to be as influential as I want it to be, because I would go to a theater, primarily the one in Denver when I was in Denver for like a year and a half in college. I would go to the same movie theater, and they had this Star Wars arcade game from the 90s. We'll talk about that later, but it included a section that was essentially the same as this, and I started getting really good at that game, and I was able to make it quite a ways. So I started getting good at that because of that game. In this game, it was a little bit harder than what I remember, but it was still a lot of fun. So yeah, I do have some personal experience with that game, just not that game in particular. It's kind of a weird way that worked. But I enjoyed that, and that was definitely fun. Next up, we have Jetpack. Now, Jetpack is a game that I hadn't heard of until we started doing I started doing these videos, basically. Most of the British computer stuff I didn't hear about. Like, I think I was in my 20s before I even heard of some of the platforms that these computer games would be on, let alone the fact that there were good games for it. I just figured that they were playing the same games that we were. But no, there's some games that are British only. And this is one of them. It's fun. It's just, I don't know. The action-oriented stuff's not necessarily for me. I'm more of a cerebral, slower pace kind of gamer. But that is... it's a good game for what it is. It just feels very kind of basic to me, but a lot of people really did like Jetpack. Next up is Elevator Action. Elevator Action is a game that I more heard about than I played. I believe that this was the first time that I got a chance to play it. It's a game that turns out to be influential because of ports and things like that, more than the arcade as far as I can remember. At least I remember more people talking about one of the ports of the game than the actual arcade version itself. A lot of these games are going to be like that, where I'm going to talk about the original version, but it's actually one of the other versions of the game that becomes what people remember. Especially when it comes to consoles, people tend to remember those more than arcade and computer games, simply because they ended up having more time with it at home. But it's kind of a case-by-case basis, but Elevator Action is definitely one of those that I feel was more important to people in the port form, but it's a fun game. It's very difficult to get a lot of work done in that game, but it turned out to be fun for, once again, what it is. We're starting to see new ideas coming in 1983, and Elevator Action, I feel, is one of them. Next up, we have The Return of the Jedi, the film. I have a note here to say we're just talking about the film. The Return of the Jedi, I've seen so many times. This was the first time in a long time that I had seen the film. I believe that I did a movie commentary on it. It's interesting because most of the stuff that I don't like about that film are because of behind-the-scenes things. And so knowing more about the behind-the-scenes work kind of influenced how I look at the film, and it would have been better if those issues did not happen. I would argue that it spends way too much time on Ewoks, and if they were Wookiees instead, that's a better film. But, you know, it's good. It's probably my least favorite of the three Star Wars films, and so I'm not... I don't know. There's not a lot for me to say. It's a great film, but compared to what came before it, I think it is a step down. You just spend way too much time with the Ewoks. I'm not a huge fan of them, but they were influential. I mean, we ended up playing a game that had Ewok-based characters, and we'll get to that, but hugely influential, just not necessarily my favorite of the bunch, but it's nice that the story concluded, right? And it concluded in a good way, I would say, at the end of it. Next up, we have Spy Hunter. Spy Hunter, I never really got a chance to play myself. I have to keep checking the time here. Spy Hunter is a good game, but like I said, I never really got a chance to play it myself. It's definitely in the genre that's not necessarily too appealing to me. In terms of like action or racing games, they're not really my thing, but this one was another good example. And I mean, it's hard not to see it have the influences of like Knight Rider or other TV shows that were kind of going around the time. Like, spies were cool. And so I'm not surprised that they made a game about it and that the game turned out to be good. Next up, we have Dragon's Lair. Now, Dragon's Lair, I, of course, played on my channel previously, and that's why I had to link it, because I did it better that time than I did this time. But overall, Dragon's Lair, it's a legendary game, and it's not necessarily for the gameplay. It is for the animation. It is a movie that you play, and that was something novel in 1983. And Don Bluth was probably the best person to do it. He was a struggling artist, so to speak, a bit. He had worked for Disney and was trying to branch out on his own, so Dragon's Lair just kind of fell into his lap, and it was a perfect fit. With that said, the Laserdisc technology isn't 100% there yet, so it ended up failing a bit because of that, but for what it was a hugely influential game, and I'm glad that I got to play it. I do like Dragon's Lair. It's just kind of an odd game looking back at it. I want it to be better than it is every time. It's just that the gameplay is too difficult. I can't imagine playing it without, the little guide at the bottom of the screen. Just so much memorization. It would easily take you upwards of months to memorize any significant amount of time in that game. So many quarters. Next up, we have Lode Runner. Lode Runner. I'm not good at Lode Runner, and I told people that up front, and people didn't listen. It's a difficult game for me. The controls kind of stick a bit. When I was playing it, and I was told, no, the controls don't stick when you're playing it there. Yeah, I don't know. It's a game that a lot of people have a lot of fond memories of, and it's released on so many different platforms, in so many very similar looking styles, that your experience is going to vary depending on which version you're playing. If you're playing it on a ZX Spectrum, it's not going to be the same as if you're playing it on an Apple II. It's not the same if you play it on an IBM PC. It's not the same. It's different every time. The version that I was playing made it difficult for me to play. So I know it's a good game, and I know that a lot of people really love it. Just when I was playing it, it got frustrating for me because it felt like my character wasn't doing what I wanted them to do. But I know it's good, and that might just be my personal experience, but that's how I played it then. And it was just, that's not what I told you to do, and I know that you should have done it properly. And on a game like that, where it's a lot about strategy and getting ahead of your opponents, that made it frustrating quickly. Next up, we have Arkhan. Arkhan's another game that I'm not good at, and a lot of people tried to correct me. Just for the record, the comments basically said that in Arkhan, there's a little ding that will tell you when it's time to shoot again. I don't believe I heard that because I was talking. I think I knew that and I just kind of forgot it while I was playing. And anytime that you're in the firing range of the computer, it will shoot every time. If you're lined up, it just automatically shoots. So you have to kind of know how the computer is going to shoot you and stay out of that range until the last possible second, then shoot and move. And that was something that's going to take a lot of time playing the game before you can get back to, or that you can be good at. So it's something that I wasn't going to be able to do in, a couple hours and get that kind of quality in my gameplay. But it was a game that I hadn't played before, and so I tried to do a bit of practice, but I could tell it wasn't going to happen in a short amount of time. But a lot of people dedicated a lot of time to this, so they are better at it than I am. Next up, we have Manic Miner. Manic Miner is another British game that I had heard about. Well, I hadn't heard about a lot of British games, but this one I had heard about. So I was excited to kind of get into it. It was very reminiscent of a lot of other games that we were playing. It reminded me also of Spelunker, so I ended up taking Spelunker out of the list of games to play because they were very similar. But Manic Miner is a fun game. Just reminds me a lot of Miner 2049er and Spelunker. It just seems like there's a lot of cave exploration games that are kind of going on in 1983. Even though this technically wasn't a cave, I don't believe. But it's a fun game. I'm glad I played it, absolutely. Just one that kind of fits in with the crowd a bit for me. Next up, we have A Tick Attack. Now, A Tick Attack I had never heard of. Kind of like Jetpack, it was only really released in England that I was able to see in Europe. Never really came over here that I saw, at least growing up, so I never really heard of it. Good game. Definitely a game that I had more enjoyment out of than I originally thought I was going to. I enjoyed the maze aspect of it. It was basically like an upgraded version of Adventure, which is a lot of fun. And something that I'm glad that I got to experience and try to sort out all the problems and the puzzles and try to get out. I almost made it. I went a long time playing that game, but I wasn't quite able to make it out. But that game was definitely one of the unexpected surprises for me in a good way. Next up, we have Wizardry 3. There's not a lot to say about Wizardry 3. It's basically Wizardry 1 and 2 again. It's the same game, just a different scenario for you to play. You have to have Wizardry 1 at least in order to play Wizardry 3. I believe I ended up having difficulty bringing the Wizardry 2 characters forward, so I ended up just using my Wizardry 1 characters, which is essentially the same thing. No real improvements in my mind. I do want a final boss, and I don't believe they gave me one here again. It was definitely just more of the same, and I feel like for the third game in a row, like I need something different. Give me something different, and this game didn't really do that for me. But I'm a huge fan of RPGs. I'll probably continue to play RPGs in their entirety, even if they're not necessarily my favorite, and this one wasn't necessarily my favorite. If you play Wizardry 1, that's probably good enough. You probably don't need to play Wizardry 2 or 3. Somebody can just kind of tell you what happens, because otherwise it's essentially going to be the same for you if you didn't enjoy the first one. Next up, we have Crystal Castles. Crystal Castles I've heard once again more of in terms of one of the ports that came out instead of the original arcade title, but the arcade title was fun and it was enjoyable. There's a few Easter eggs in it, that's always nice, but this is something that I hadn't had a chance to play myself. So I was happy that I got to play it, and I had a good time with it. Next up, we have Planetfall. Planetfall was, once again, an unexpected surprise. It almost didn't make my list. I had heard I mean, I hadn't heard about it before we started, but I had heard while I was researching it that, it's an Infocom game. Some people see it as their favorite, some people don't. And that's why I ended up making it. So I thought to myself, if it's better than, the original Zork games, or some people say it's better than the original Zork games, then it's worth checking out. Glad I did. Had a lot of fun playing Planetfall. I liked the humor of it. I liked the idea of kind of surviving. It was a lot of fun. Looks like my neighbor's doing some work outside. Hopefully you guys can't hear that. Next up is Bomberman. Bomberman. Oh man, I have a lot of experience with the character. I have looked into this original one before, but I had never actually fully sat down and played the original Bomberman before. And of course the version that we played wasn't really the original version. It was a version of the game. That might end up happening a little bit more. Oh, sorry, I skipped a video. Famicom. The Famicom, yeah. I have a lot of experience with the Famicom. We'll talk about that in more detail some other time, but basically I had a Famicom growing up. In a sense. So we're gonna talk about the Famicom quite a bit. That probably to nobody's surprise. If you know anything about the history of video games, you probably know that we're going to talk about the Famicom. But I'm trying to keep everything kind of separate. We're just talking about what happened in 1983, and in 1983, it is this red and white toy-looking console named the Famicom, and we will. There's not a lot of games that were released for it in 1983, but that's not going to matter too much by 1984. So Bomberman again. Once again, I have a lot of experience with the character. I've played this style of game before, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm good at it. I never feel that I am super good at it because I end up screwing myself over a lot in that kind of game. But this original version, I was happy to get into it and play it a bit. It's a lot of fun. It is a good, influential title. Of course, we didn't get to play the original version. We played pretty much one of the original home versions for American audiences. And we're going to experience that a lot, that there's going to be Japanese, especially Japanese computer games, that we are not going to be able to get a working American version for kind of at all. Or if I can find it, it's going to look a lot better than the original Japanese version did because it took so long to be released in America. After all, America is struggling and it's a lot of money to translate and produce and ship American games for a lot of these Japanese companies. So especially a smaller company like Hudson Soft, they're not going to be, well, is it Hudson? Or is it Data East? No, I believe it's Hudson. They're not going to be able to, manufacture that easily, so it's not necessarily worth their money until much, much later. Next up, we have Enchanter. Enchanter is one that I had vaguely heard about before I got started with all of this, but it was definitely something that I hadn't had a chance to really look into myself. Enchanter is an interesting title. I had fun playing it. I don't know. It was good. I would say it wasn't necessarily the best Infocom title that we had played, but it was its own world. There were all these magic spells that we could use, and so there was a lot going for it. It just didn't execute everything as well as I would have liked. But it was good, and I'm glad I played it. Next up is, I believe, our longest running series of the year, Ultima 3. I had a lot of hopes for Ultima 3, and a lot of them were dashed. I feel like I was not the only one that felt that way. Ultima 3, I mean, it took a lot of things from Wizardry and integrated that into, I believe, the better franchise in Ultima, but it missed a few things. The balance issues are very apparent in that. They had a couple things that seemed to just be for frustration's sake, like the new way that the moon gates worked, and the ship now having wind on it that makes it difficult to move around, and that seems to be the only purpose of it, is to make it difficult to move around. Those things didn't necessarily work for me, but the fact that you do have to go into multiple dungeons, that they each have a set design, I enjoyed that. And then ultimately the end of the game was a letdown. and I won't talk about it too much, but people that saw it know the final dungeon, let's say, the final area. It was difficult. It had a good difficulty level, don't get me wrong, but that difficulty level was due to a reason that I didn't enjoy, which was randomness, as opposed to a difficult enemy, so to speak. All right, next up we have Tapper. Tapper's a little interesting, and I need to talk about that one for a bit. Tapper, I mean, I've played Tapper-style games a lot before. I don't think I ever played the original before. So kind of looking back at it, it ends up being a version of kind of a, I don't know how to describe it. It ends up being a type of game that you see a lot of. There are a lot of versions of Tapper out there. I would say that Tempest is probably the closest in my mind to what I'm talking about, which is this thing tries to come all the way over here and it's your job to stop it. I mean, we had seen that in like Centipede and Millipede before as well, but Tempest is the one where like the thing that slowly comes on and you have to manage, different lanes. It comes to mind, and so they moved that over into this realm, and I think it was very successful. I think that Tapper was a lot of fun. The reason that I wanted to talk about it a little bit more in detail is that behind the scenes, YouTube's algorithm got a hold of Tapper. It is the first video that I know of that I've ever had where YouTube actually pushed it onto people's home pages. I have never had that before. So I got a little taste of the algorithm with Tapper. And all of a sudden I'm looking at it on, day 1, day 2, normal amount of views. Suddenly on day 3, I'm getting like 10 times as many views and I can't figure out why. And I'm like watching it throughout the day, and it became apparent that they just pushed it onto people's home pages. And they only did it for the one day. And I don't know why. I don't know why they picked this one out of all of my videos. But, if you came here because of Tapper, happy to have you. I'm glad you clicked on the recommended videos. That's never happened to me before. Hasn't happened since. Not sure if that's going to be a thing that happens anytime again. But as far as I know, YouTube pushed Tapper for me. I don't know. I'll take it. Thank you, YouTube. I would argue there were better videos for you to select, but Tapper is a good game, so hooray. Next up we have Track and Field. Now, Track and Field I had never actually played before. I have played games like Track and Field before that use the same control scheme as Track and Field, but I never actually played the original. And that game is hard. That is a hard game. I was able to find people that did... I don't know how to describe this in 1983 standards, but basically they had other programs that they could use to manipulate the Track and Field video game program and basically make it as good as possible. We call it tool assisted in the modern world. They did that, and they were able to go through the game 3 times through. I wasn't even able to go 1 time through, but that shows how difficult that game is that even in the best case scenario, you're not going to be able to play it forever. And that's how hard that game got. Fun game. Definitely one that I would want to be able to cheat some way to play. Try to figure out. And this is the first game that I can think of where I actively want to cheat in order to be better at the game. Because, just that tapping back and forth like this, or like this, or like this, it doesn't matter. It's very difficult to keep that up for as long as that game wants you to. So that's why a lot of people just put a metal ruler and go like that and just flick it and hope for the best, or slide a coin or something. It's a game that encourages cheating, I would argue. But it's fun, and the fact that people wanted to cheat on it and the fact that I want to cheat on it shows that it's a good game. So I had a lot of fun playing that. Donkey Kong 3. Donkey Kong 3 was a disappointment for me. I'm sure it has its fans, but for me, it is the weakest entry in the Donkey Kong franchise. I would rather play 1 or Junior Donkey Kong 3 doesn't really appeal to me. It's a shooter, and there are better shooters out there. I'd rather play Galaga if I'm going to play a shooter. I'd rather play Gyrus if I'm going to play a shooter. This one just doesn't appeal to me just because Donkey Kong's in it. But because it's Donkey Kong and there aren't a ton of Donkey Kong games, which we'll talk about when we get to Pac-Man. But Donkey Kong, it was worth talking about. I'm glad I played it, but it's not a game I would ever go back to. It is the only game that I thought to myself while playing it, I'm not going to purposely die, but I kind of hope I die so I can be done with this. And that's never a good sign. And then the last game that we played was Space Ace. Space Ace is a game that I had heard about, but I never got a chance to play. It's a good game because it's Don Bluth animation. But I would argue that it's a harder game than Dragon's Lair. The pacing issues are quite apparent. They're very off. It has to go very quickly, and I assume that has a lot to do with them not willing to dedicate a lot of time to the animation, the same way that they did in Dragon's Lair. So in Dragon's Lair, you would hit a couple buttons, and then you would get like a little scene of Dirk kind of going through the door. In Space Ace, you didn't get that. It was just boom, boom, boom. You had to keep doing something. Because those little scenes of Dirk walking through the door, you have to animate. And that takes time, and that takes money, and I don't feel like they were willing to put as much money towards Space Ace as they were Dragon's Lair. But it was still fun. It's very... I think it's important to kind of talk about these two Laserdisc games in 1983 because they were a huge fad, even though the Space Ace was on the downside of it. The fad did not last long, and we only talked about two games in detail in terms of the Laserdisc games, but there were others out there. It's just that the others were honorable mentions because I didn't think they were as good, and neither did other people, apparently. All right, so those were the videos that we actually made, or I actually made this year. Let's talk about some things that were almost their own videos, but I ended up taking them out. I'll talk a bit about them. The first one is Pole Position 2. Pole Position 2 was incredibly popular. You can argue that it was, the most popular game of 1984. That is an argument to be made. It depends on how you calculate it, though. Are you calculating in terms of cabinet sales or revenue that the arcade came in? And those are two different games in 1984. But Pole Position 2 was a hugely popular game. My issue with it was that it was essentially the exact same game, just with new tracks and a different color scheme for the car and a slightly different animation for the explosion and different billboards because they had different sponsors. But ultimately, it was the exact same game. So there was not a lot for me to talk about with it. So I ended up making it an honorable mention video. Otherwise, it would be like a 6-minute video, like how I would fail at all 4 different tracks. And then we would have to call it a video. There was nothing else for really me to talk about with it, so I didn't. Next up is Mule. Mule almost got into its own video. I know that it is an influential video game to some extent, but it's a complicated game. Like I said, it did not sell well. The actual number is 30,000 copies. That's almost nothing. I believe that even Akalabeth, which we didn't talk about, sold more than that, and that was through mail order. This one should have been released, fully by Electronic Arts for the Atari computers, which there were a decent number of those out there by the end of 1983. Still didn't sell well. One of the things about the game is that it has a cult following, and that cult following, I feel, developed over a decade later. Like I said, critics at the time were fans of it, and it did make a couple top 100, top video games of all time list. On one of them, it reached number 3. That was weird for me. But I looked at that list, and I disagreed with it so much that I don't even really count that list. I'm sorry, but that was a wrong list. But another person put it like 96 out of top 100 or something like that. But it is an influential game, but like I said, it doesn't seem to influence people until much, much later. And it influences them more in concept than it does in the actual game itself, is best I can figure, is that it is a game where there is no violence. You're trying to build a colony and make the most money. And so that concept ended up influencing other people to make similar concepts. But that, like, a lot of that stuff doesn't happen for years. And it had a lot of people come back to it after a decade. And we'll actually talk about that a little bit more later. But yeah, that one was a weird one. Not particularly important at the time is why I ended up not dealing with it. Plus, there's a lot of like conflicting information about it. And then I did play it, and it seems to be definitely geared towards a 4-player experience as opposed to a 1-player experience. And the 1-player experience for me was not good. So that's why it ended up not being its own video. But it was close, and I thought about it. Next up, we have Mud. A lot of people wanted me to play Mud. I had a few requests for that. A couple issues with it. Number one, it's really difficult to replicate that these days. Like, even as late as 2016, it was easier to do it. But these days, it's difficult to replicate Mud. But number two, Mud's a weird game because it was continually being developed. Like, if you played it in 1983 versus 1978 versus 1988, those are 3 different experiences. You're going to have different rooms, different puzzles, things like that. And because it was continually developed until basically it stopped in like 2012 or something like that, it's a difficult game to kind of get in and play and have a set experience of what it was. So I ended up avoiding it for reasons like that. It's like I said, I don't know a lot of people that played the original Mud, but I know that it was available for people, and it turned out to be influential, and they made other Muds. But the first one, I don't know. It ends up being called British Legends for a while. You might have heard it under that name. But like I said, it's when a game's continually under development, when do I just single it out and go, okay, now I play it, this is the version, and I couldn't come up with a good time for that. Next up, we have the Dark Crystal. The Dark Crystal, I wanted to play that video game, and I was geared up to play that video game. I was going to do it. It's a Sierra game. Those are always at least a little fun for me to play. I couldn't get it to work. It's another multi-disc game, and as soon as I needed to put in a second disc, it failed on me. And I could not find a version anywhere out there that would allow me to get that to work. So just logistics. I couldn't get it to work, so that's why we didn't play it. Next up is Crawl. There's a few different Crawl games, but I ultimately decided against doing it. Number one, because I feel that the movie itself is not that important. It's probably the best kind of fantasy film of 1983, but there are better films in 1984 that come along and completely overshadow it. And the game itself seems a little boring towards the end, so ultimately I took those 2 out. Because if I was going to do the Crawl video game, I also needed to talk about the film. And I wasn't a huge fan of the film, and the games themselves aren't influential enough for me to also talk about the film. So there you go. And then MSX. I almost dedicated an entire video to talk about the MSX architecture, but ultimately all that I could come up to talk about, I put into the honorable mentions video, and that wasn't enough to be its own video. So those are the things that I almost put in to their own video, but ultimately decided against it. It's not that I have anything against these things, it's just that for one reason or another, they didn't quite fit the mold of what I was trying to do with the videos. Next up, some things I learned. Let me just kind of read this one out. Despite the crash, there's still a lot going on. There's some positive things still going, but there are a lot of negative things, as well as a ton of mediocrity. There's a lot of mediocre things out there. There's some innovation, right? Mule was innovative. I'm going to say it wrong, but I believe it's Bokosuka Wars. That's something new, especially in the world of computers and Japanese computers. Shout out to Portopia Zero murder case. There's innovations that are happening. There's combinations of things that are going that we haven't necessarily seen before. But they're not that influential right now. Well, they're not that important, I should say, right now. They end up influencing things later, and they're not popular. Look at Mule only selling 30,000 copies. For a game that people absolutely loved. Some people loved, and other people just didn't talk about and didn't know it existed. But most of what we're seeing and most of what is popular is just rehashes of what's already been done. I mean, the most popular, the highest selling game of 1983 for home systems was Ms. Pac-Man, which came out in 1982, and even that was just kind of a different version of a game that came out in 1980. 3 years at this point seems like a lifetime, and for that to still be the best-selling game of the year, it doesn't look good. And yeah, we already saw, we'll kind of skip one here. We'll go to console gaming, and that kind of goes into this point as well. Console gaming in 1983 is basically just arcade gaming just watered down. And that seems to be very disappointing. I figured by now we might start seeing something different. There were some good original titles for the Atari 2600 in previous years. But this year we didn't talk about any Atari 2600 titles. We didn't do any videos on a console game at all, because most of what is being released is just a port of an arcade game. And those are the best games out there, according to a lot of people at the time. You get to play Ms. Pac-Man at home. Can you believe it? Yeah, I can. But that's the best-selling game? That's the best game? Really? I don't know. In 1983, we started seeing the rise of British gaming. And I was kind of surprised to see that. I do know that British gaming, has a history to it that I don't often get to see. As an American, there are a lot of titles and a lot of franchises even that I never heard about that we're going to talk about. Like I said, I didn't even hear about the console, the platform itself until I was in my 20s, because it just never made it over to the States. And of course, a lot of that is computer based. And why would you buy a British computer in America? You just there's so many American computers for you to choose from. So we're starting to see the rise of British gaming. We have, of course, been tracking the rise of Japanese gaming. Honestly, though, keeping an eye on it, American gaming is in decline. It's not gone by any means, but the fact that we didn't talk about an Atari 2600 game kind of shows that, the American side isn't necessarily doing as well right now. We're seeing the rise of Japanese and British gaming as a result. Next up we have honorable mentions videos. Honorable mentions videos, they're going to need to be split moving forward. I can't keep doing 50-minute honorable mention videos. Those take a long time for me to record. So I'm going to start splitting it. My original idea when I first started this was that eventually I was going to split it by topic and have, this is what's going on in computers, this is what's going on in consoles, this is what's going on in ports, this is what's going on in the industry, at the company level and things like that. But looking at it now, especially in 1984, it's much better for me to start splitting things in terms of timeline. So we're going to have first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter, basically. We're going to do it 3 months at a time. Split it into 4 videos. Based on what I have in my notes, that's probably going to be the best. They'll probably still be 12 minutes each. But we'll talk about that a little bit more. Just keep in mind that I might be playing a little bit fast and loose with timelines. If I don't know the timeline, right, it just says, I don't know, this game was released sometime in 1984. I might move it into the first quarter, even though it got released in December, and I just don't know that, right? If I can't find the information, I'm just going to move it around wherever I think it fits best. Next up, I do have 1983 kind of as a whole. The crash so far is just primarily affecting Atari. Atari seems to be the only company that's really suffering. And to be honest, it's kind of well-deserved. They were the ones that made the mistakes, right? They're the ones that made the Atari 5200, and it's not good. Even though the quality of the games are better, the control scheme is so much worse that nobody's willing to play it. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more in 1984 when we revisit the Atari 5200 for one reason or another. But the 5200's not doing well. Their computers aren't doing as well as, the Commodore 64 or the Apple computers. So it's kind of well-deserved that Atari is suffering. Of course, they also made the port of Pac-Man and E.T. I would argue that the port of Pac-Man is the main reason that Atari is suffering. But that's because of sales and all that. But Atari is the one that is suffering the most. And right now, they seem to be the only one. Nobody else is really making the drastic changes that Atari is. We'll see if that continues in 1984, but in 1983, it really is just Atari right now. Of course, we have to start looking at like Activision, whose entire company model is based on Atari making sales. So what's Activision going to be doing? But right now, we don't see that big of a change in Activision. They didn't release any major titles this year, but they did release some ports of their old games, and those seem to be doing well. Next up is, reproducing old computer games. So computer games are still the hardest to reproduce on a modern machine, and I am struggling to get some things to work, right? We talked about the Dark Crystal. There were also a couple streams that I did in 1982, I believe, that made it very difficult, and I think it was Time Zone or Time Warp. I think it was Time Zone, that I was like halfway through the game, and then all of a sudden the game just stopped working for me, and I couldn't go any further because this one disc didn't work out of like the 12 discs. So it's still hit or miss. I'm going to keep working at it. If it was originally released for DOS, especially IBM PC DOS as it's known at the time, it's a lot easier for me to do. But if it's a different platform, if it's like an Atari 800 or even the Apple II, there's some struggles that I still have with those. In particular, Japanese computer games, there's not a lot I can do. If it's released for a Japanese computer game, I don't speak Japanese. Even if they have a way of handling the Japanese computer games, that doesn't necessarily mean I can personally recreate it. So the Japanese computer games, we might not play a lot of those because of the issues with recreating them. Console and even arcade gaming is a lot easier for me to do. The only arcade games that I knew for a fact I wasn't going to be able to recreate in an arcade setting were Dragon's Lair and Space Ace. And since I was able to find a version of that was true to the original arcade version, I found a workaround. I'm not always going to be able to find workarounds, though. If there are future games that I'm struggling to recreate, I might have to skip them simply because I couldn't make it work. And we saw that with the Dark Crystal, but it might happen again, especially these Japanese titles that prove to be very influential later on. But I can't get the original version to work because it's on a Japanese computer, and that's very hard to translate to American modern computers. Once again, this video is taking longer than I thought, so I apologize once again for its length, but we still have quite a bit to talk about. Keep on having to make cuts because the equipment just doesn't like me when I do these videos. So we'll start with things to keep in mind, or start back up with things to keep in mind. Once again, as we have talked about, the video game industry in 1983, early 80s as a whole, isn't the most inclusive industry for you to work in. So anytime that there is somebody from kind of a marginalized community, it's worth mentioning. So there is an undercurrent of LGBTQ plus community in the industry. So let's mention a few names here. We have Danielle Bunton-Berry, who made Mule, that we have talked about quite extensively. We have Rebecca Heineman, who founded Interplay in 1983. We might take a look at Interplay, a video game developer, later. We have Jamie Fenton, who helped create 1981's Gorf. We have Vida Hlubinka Cook, who worked at Bruderbund in 1983. And we have Catherine Mataga, who helped make 1982's Seamus. So if you were to play these games, look at the information from the 80s. These people will have different names. They came out as trans publicly afterwards, but it is worth noting that there is kind of this undercurrent in the industry, and it's worth absolutely pointing out. We will probably keep an eye on these as we continue. A lot of this delves into people's personal lives in ways that I don't often research because it starts getting weird, but it is noting that this influence is there, and there is much more than just the static, this is what a video game is, and a lot of the games that we just talked about exemplify that. Another thing that I did want to talk about is the continued and growing influence of Donkey Kong. Donkey Kong is arguably the most popular franchise in 1983. I would argue that it's on par with, if not above, Pac-Man by this point in terms of video games. And the mainstream Pac-Man is still number one in terms of like TV shows and things like that. But Donkey Kong is up there, and we will be keeping an eye on it. We have some things to talk about next year with that as well. One of the other things I want to talk about in terms of Pac-Man is just how completely oversaturated Pac-Man is on the market. I mean, we have a TV show, we have pinball machines, we have more video games than I've even talked about. I have not talked about every game in the Pac-Man franchise. There's a few that just kind of got released. People said it was okay, and then it went away. I want to talk about some of the good games and some of the just weird games, but there's other games out there. I should point out, because I didn't mention it in the honorable mentions, there is a Pac-Man land that opens up in 1983, specifically in Six Flags Over Texas, because Bally Manufacturing, Bally Midway, they own Six Flags. They purchased it, I believe, in 1982. And it could be 1983 as well. I'm sorry, I didn't put that in my notes. But Bally Manufacturing, Bally Midway, they were responsible for distributing and publishing Pac-Man games in America, so it seemed right to mix those two. So there was a Pac-Man land in Six Flags Over Texas. That only lasted until 1985. There was also a Pac-Man playground at Six Flags Over Georgia, but I couldn't find a lot of information on that. It seems just to be a literal playground with Pac-Man in it, but I couldn't find much more about it than that. So Pac-Man has a lot of mediocrity out there at this point, and now it's made it to mainstream with TV shows and amusement parks. You're going to see kind of Pac-Man kind of fall, I believe, because there's so much of him out there that it's not sustainable. The game, I feel, is not good enough, and it hasn't evolved enough over the years to justify this kind of idolization of the character. But Pac-Man arguably could be also the most successful franchise of 1983. I would make the push for Donkey Kong because of how popular it is in the industry and how much people are pushing for the ports and stuff like that. People are much more excited about Donkey Kong than they are Pac-Man at the time, and I think that's important. Next up, Laserdiscs. Laserdisc games were a huge deal. We only really talked about, I believe, 3 or 4 of them in total, including only 2 videos that we actually played it. But they're a passing fad. The technology really isn't there to mesh like a movie and a video game. We saw them attempt that with Astron Belt, and it just looked off to me. And I think that even at the time, people would see that and think it's not quite right. The way to do it, I think, is definitely more in the vein of a Dragon's Lair or a Space Ace, where you just kind of have to hit a couple buttons and it becomes more of like a choose your own adventure type game. I think that would be the better way to go with it. But because the technology isn't quite there to reliably play Laserdisc games and use that search feature, and that's causing issues, they just couldn't last long. And so there were several other games that kind of failed at the time, and the Halcyon failed. So yeah, Laserdiscs were a passing fad, but Dragon's Lair is the standout of it, and that's the one that people remember. But Space Ace is worth talking about as well, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in 1984. But yeah, they were a huge deal and then faded, and that happens, especially in video game industry. There's a lot of fads, we'll call it. Next up, just kind of a reminder. We will talk about and sum up the consoles and computers when they are discontinued. There's been a couple people that wanted me basically in the introduction video of the development and the initial release of a console or a computer. They wanted me to talk about how influential it ended up being, and that's not really the point of those videos. For instance, like the Atari VCS at the time when it was released in 1977, it wouldn't have made sense for me to talk about how hugely influential it became in 1977 because we haven't actually seen it. I would rather kind of track along and watch how it grows and how influential it becomes, and then kind of round things out when it's discontinued and talk about its legacy and all that kind of stuff. So we're always going to talk about it at the end and not necessarily at the beginning. I think the ColecoVision and the Commodore 64 people were upset that I didn't talk more about what happened afterwards, but we will get there, and then we'll do a sum up video, probably in the honorable mentions, but still we'll talk about it. Next thing keep in mind is if you missed it in the honorable mentions videos, which I wouldn't blame you because there were so many ports in that, Atari and Parker Brothers are really dominating the port industry. If there is such a thing as the port industry, Atari and Parker Brothers are dominating it, right? The Atari in particular is releasing so many things for the Atari 2600, the 5200 for their computers, and for Apple IIs. Parker Brothers is also doing quite a bit, and Parker Brothers is not a name you typically associate today with video games, but they were releasing a lot of games themselves and also releasing a lot of ports. And then, yeah, ports as a whole, I still want to talk about it. Luckily, we're not going to have to talk about it as much. I believe 1983 is the longest list of ports that I had on my list. It's different games, in my opinion. Like playing a game in the arcade and playing a game on with the same name and everything on the Atari 2600, those are two different experiences. And I felt the need to point those out and show you the differences. Because as we talked about, the best-selling home game of 1983 was a port. Best-selling game of 1982 was also a port. The ports are so important because it's how a lot of people experienced the game at all. Some people, I'm sure, never even played it in the arcade and just waited for it to be released for the Atari 2600 and went out and bought it. Not everybody has access to arcades after all, so I'm sure that happens. And so I want to point out not only the overall idea of the ports being different from the original, but ports being different from other ports of the same game. Frogger is a great example. If you bought the game thinking you were going to get that Starpath Supercharger, the official Frogger port, and you end up getting the other Atari 2600 port, you're probably going to be a bit disappointed, but at the same time, the regular Parker Brothers Atari 2600 port was the most popular version. And a lot of times, just because things are popular doesn't necessarily mean it's the highest quality version of it, at least back then. There's not a lot of journalism going around at the time. All right, so that's kind of the ports. Like I said, we're going to do less of them as we continue because just how the industry evolves. But I will continue to talk about them if I feel they're different versions and different experiences than the original. If it's pretty much the same game, just released on different platforms, I probably won't talk about it that much. But right now, it is a very different experience. And then the last one is, although we don't talk about it much, Apple is dominating the educational home computer market. If you're in school and they have a computer, chances are it's some version of an Apple II. And that's worth talking about because that's a lot of people, especially in America's, first experience with computers and video games is through the school. And so we don't talk about it much, but the educational market is one that's worth paying attention to, at least behind the scenes. And right now that means Apple IIs, and Apple IICs, and Apple IIes, and Apple II Pluses, some version of the Apple II. When you're trying to reach children and influence them to want a certain type of computer, educational market is probably the best way to go. And that still means Apple at this point. So it's worth mentioning that. All right, let's get into some awards. We're starting to get towards the end here, finally. Yeah, it's been a long video. All right, so we'll start with my favorite film. Now, this one was a little tough for me. I'll go over the honorable mentions first because the main one might surprise you. So the honorable mentions, once again, not necessarily things that impact video games, just my personal favorite of the year. So Monty Python's The Meaning of Life gets an honorable mention. I do really enjoy certain scenes in that. There are certain sketches, I guess you could say. There are certain bits in there that I actually do really like. But overall, like a lot of sketches and bits and stuff like that, it's a little hit or miss, but I really do enjoy certain bits of that. Return of the Jedi also is an honorable mention. Once again, not my favorite of the three Star Wars films that we've talked about so far. The holiday special doesn't count as a film. But it's still good. It's just kind of a letdown compared to the other ones. Scarface also makes the cut as an honorable mention. It's not my favorite, but it's got so many quotable lines, and it's got so many iconic scenes that I felt, I enjoy it. It's just not something I go back to very often. Not one of my favorite films of all time, but honorable mention, yeah, sure, why not? My favorite film is a Japanese film that some people know of, some people don't. It's called Barefoot Gen. It is a hard film. It is a deep and depressing film, but it's so good. It's one that you probably want to watch once and probably never again. I'll just put it very briefly. It is the true story, or, fictionalized true story, if you will. It's basically an autobiography from the creator of him surviving being a poor child in Japan during World War II. So it's a very heavy film. Know that going in, but it's very good, and it's definitely worth the watch. And it's my favorite film of 1983. So there is that. Favorite TV show? There are a few good ones that came out in 1983. For me, it's actually going to be Captain Tsubasa, which I believe we mentioned. It is a soccer anime. It's the story of a young child who is gifted at soccer or football, whatever you want to call it, and it's him learning to get better and playing on a team and stuff like that. It's good. I like it. Some honorable mentions: Inspector Gadget, Fraggle Rock, Doctor Who, Urusei Yatsura, and Macross. Honorable mentions: I like Captain Tsubasa better. It's I think it's a better show. But there's in 1983. There's starting to be what I would say is good TV shows and good children's entertainment, because adult TV shows at the time, they're so bland. Doctor Who being the exception, but Doctor Who's kind of always the exception, right? But it's not like I'm in 1983 like, oh, let's go watch Dallas, right? Like, I'm not interested. That's not for me. All right, let's go into the video games now. We'll start with the most disappointing game. I do want to point out that there was nothing that was super disappointing overall, but since I had to pick one, it was Donkey Kong 3. Donkey Kong 3, like I said, I was playing it and I was like, I could be done right now. And I still had like 2 or 3 lives left. I was just like, I'm bored by this now. It just didn't keep my attention and keep me wanting to go on to the next one. It was so easy to get through all the levels, of which there were only 3, which is already a technical step down from the other Donkey Kong games. It was mediocre. And on my list, mediocre means most disappointing sometimes. A game that aged the worst. Now, this is different from, my personal experience with it. It's games that I feel going back to, it has the biggest discrepancy between how people felt at the time and how people feel now. And I have to say this because I know a lot of people like this game. But for me, it's Arkhan. And it's because the graphics and the gameplay have improved in a style, that style of game, so much over the years that this one's going to be difficult to go back to if you have played some of the later titles. So, not the worst game. Like I said, for me, that was Donkey Kong 3 of the games that we played, but Arkhan, I feel, is the hardest to recommend for a modern audience to go back to if you did not play it. I feel that the gameplay is very dated, and even though it was revolutionary at the time, and the graphics, although pretty good, I feel that they're not going to be compelling for a new audience. So if you grew up with it, I understand why you love it, but if you didn't grow up with it, it's going to be hard to get people to go back and play it. All right, favorite arcade game. I honestly couldn't decide at the end of the day, so I gave it a tie between Tapper and Star Wars. They both have gameplay that I really like. Tapper has the better graphics of the bunch, but I would say Star Wars has the better feel when I play it. So I just couldn't split it between the two, so I gave it to both, Tapper and Star Wars. All right, next up is favorite console game. Didn't play any, so I can't give it to any of them. There were a lot in the honorable mentions, but I decided that since we didn't play any of them on a video, it's not fair for me to talk about them too much. I didn't really play the ports, so just going to have to skip it. Next year we won't skip it. Favorite console? Once again, I'm going to give it to the ColecoVision, assuming once again that you have the expansion on it. If you have the expansion to play the Atari 2600s on your Atari 2600 games on your ColecoVision, then the ColecoVision is the best console. It has 500 games for you to choose from, including some high quality versions of Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr., which are among the best games that are available on the home market at the time, in my opinion. Plus, you can play. I can't give it to the Atari 2600 if something else also plays it. I should also point out, which I didn't mention in the honorable mentions video, that in 1983 Intellivision also came out with an expansion that would play the Atari 2600 games as well, but this expansion wasn't as widespread as the ColecoVision one was, and the ColecoVision one is the much more important one because it actually generated a lawsuit between Atari and Coleco, as you might imagine, but it was settled out of court, so it's still legally dubious whether that is an okay thing to do, but since they settled, Intellivision kind of came out with their own version as well, but the Intellivision, it's not doing well as a console compared to the ColecoVision at the time, because Coleco had Donkey Kong, and Mattel has lawsuit issues. So I still have to give it to the ColecoVision. But I mean, I know some people want me to put the Famicom here, but by the end of 1983, there aren't a lot of games for the Famicom. So ColecoVision is where it's at for me right now. Not saying that'll be that way in 1984. Just saying 1983, December 31st, ColecoVision. All right. Favorite computer game. This one was a little difficult. I had to kind of look over the games itself, right? Of course, I'm an RPG guy, so, you know, my first thought is Wizardry 3 and Ultima 3, but no. At the end of it, I decided to give it to Planetfall. Planetfall was my favorite game. I loved the humor of it. I loved the adventure of it. I just like, at this point, the text adventure games are the ones that feel the most complete to me. Especially compared to the RPGs that I want to be more complete than they are. So, Planetfall. And then, no surprises, favorite game of the year goes to Planetfall as well. So that is definitely it. Planetfall was my favorite game that I played. All right, moving on. We'll talk about some of the awards at the time. There were the Arcade Awards. The Arcade Awards said that the best arcade game was Pole Position, which of course came out in 1982, but was hugely influential in 1983. And I can easily see why they chose that from a technical standpoint. It is a great game. Once again, though, I'm not sure how long you could stay playing it, but what do I know? They gave the console game to Ms. Pac-Man for the Atari 2600 and Ladybug, which we haven't talked about a lot, but I believe is another maze game. For computer game, they gave it to Lode Runner, which, once again, maybe I just had a bad experience with it. I know a lot of people love Lode Runner, so I'm not surprised that they gave it to that. But they don't really like the text-based adventure games in these awards. And I feel like they discount them more than they should. And then they also had one for a standalone game. I'm not entirely sure what the qualifications for a standalone game are, but they gave it to Q*bert. Just throwing that out there because I legitimately don't really know what the criteria for that is compared to an arcade game. Then there's a new awards in England. It goes by the Golden Joystick Awards. They specifically talk about British computer games, and they gave that one to Jetpack, which is not a huge surprise. Of the British computer games that we played, I probably would have given it to a Tic Tac. I liked that one the best because it felt like a full adventure game, but I know a lot of people really liked Jetpack, so not surprising. All right, checking their time again. So we'll quickly go through the list of patrons. I want to give a thank you to all the patrons. I do link the Patreon at the bottom of every video if you want to help support the channel. There's a few perks that you get, but there's no tiers anymore, and it all starts for $1 a month. But you get mentioned in these videos. That's one of the perks. So let's list out the patrons. We do have Mike Lindgren, Joe B., Daniel, Squirrel Dash, Lymanity, Veronica Gross, Alex Jones, The Smash Project 101. I was told to say Isa, but I think it's Izaoi. Let's go with that. I think it's Gibbous Wearing Brony and Walkie Wall. Thank you for your support. That is very meaningful to me. All right, next up we do have the patron contributions. I asked everybody what their thoughts on 1983 are, and here are the results I got. From the Smash Project 101, overall, a solid year for arcades. Mario Brothers, Star Wars, and Tapper were my favorite games. I felt the computer games were a bit lacking, though. I had high expectations for Ultima 3, but I felt it was a tad underwhelming because of the lack of direction and obtuse puzzles. Hard to disagree with that. Ultima 3 was a bit of a letdown. I was hoping for better things. I wouldn't say it was disappointing overall, just disappointing for the expectations that Ultima 1 and 2 put on it. Next up we have Gibbous Wearing Brony. I'm not caught up on the series yet, I'm still watching your videos about 1981, but I want to at least give a shout out to the incredible music of 1983, both in terms of how good the best stuff is and how rare the bad stuff is. If you want to get into 80s music as a casual listener, this year's the place to start. If memory serves me right, because this is going off the top of my head in memory, so forgive me if I'm off, but I believe my favorite songs of 1983, which is something I don't include because it's so personal and stuff like that, but I believe that My Sharona and Sweet Dreams came out in 1983. Sweet Dreams are made of these, so I believe that is when I started noticing that 1983 music started sounding like 80s music was 1983, so that I agree with that. Next up, we have Walkie Wall. It's so interesting how fast games are improving. The graphics, sound, presentation all have shown amazing capabilities in just this year alone. The games being covered are to a point where they no longer feel simple. The arcade games have depths, and the RPGs feel like they are reaching modern standards so quickly. There's a lot of old school gamers, and we're getting to a point that's very familiar to most. I thought this was interesting. At this point, 5 Smash characters have been covered. I don't know what that means. Meaning the series has evolved from showing the humble beginnings to starting to show off some gaming legends. Thank you so much for doing this series. I'm really excited to see what holds in store for us next. Yeah, that was something that I had planned for the old channel, was trying to do background and then all the combination at one point. If you know, you know. If you don't worry about it. But yeah, we're definitely seeing some big names start to come out, and we will keep track of them as we continue. And then, should they combine at some point, we'll talk about that. Isa says, me and my boyfriend Demi watched the entirety of the videos on 1983 together as they were released, as we have been doing and will continue to do for the whole series. And since it's the first time we participate in one of these, I wanted to give some context, since we both wanted to share our thoughts on what we saw this year, both the good and the bad. So here are my thoughts on this year of games. I'm a 93 kid, as such I have no direct childhood experience with anything in this year, and I didn't directly come across any of it in later years, besides of course knowing the existence of Mario Brothers and Bomberman. I'm excited to enter the Famicom era, as it's home to many titles I ended up appreciating later on when gaming became more accessible to everyone. But unfortunately, I never owned that console or future iterations personally, not even when it was released in Europe, late compared to almost everywhere else. Yeah, we'll talk about that. Like, it's almost different markets at this point. That being said, as an RPG fan, I would love to have much good to say about Ultima 3, but unfortunately, that's not the case. Seems to be a common theme so far. While I do recognize the advancements in the title, some aspects of it left me wondering if making it more complicated didn't just kill the enjoyment for me a bit. In Ultima 1 and 2, for as flawed as they were, I felt like the absence of many complex systems helped in making it more intuitive for me, a little at least. They are still not super intuitive as games. Yeah, there's a lot of behind the scenes stuff that you have to know going into RPGs in the early 80s that is going to be off-putting for a lot of people. And if you're not familiar with the Dungeons & Dragons system, you're going to have difficulty kind of getting into the RPGs, even with the explanations that they give you. Issa continues, Dragon's Lair and Space Ace would win the title of weirdest games for me this year because I'm very ambivalent about them. The visual and humor appeal is evident, even if outdated. It stands out compared to the competition, but the actual game structure makes it somewhat unplayable to me personally. Not even at the lowest difficulty and with all the help I could ever manage. I don't know how people did it back then. Tons of quarters and memorization. If you only had 5 games to play at your arcade, and one of them was Dragon's Lair, you're going to spend a lot of time memorizing Dragon's Lair. That's the way I look at it. So those games definitely enter the list of something new that I learned. I don't think I will forget them ever again. As for my favorite, I think I have to give it to Planetfall. The witty manual and somewhat well-written plot makes it a memorable, overall positive experience for me. All in all, interesting year. Feels like the last step before a jump, which may be premature, but we shall see. Spoilers. I won't give that away, but I definitely have opinions on what happens. Isa continues. Demi had many similar opinions and thoughts, but he also wrote some different things. Here are his thoughts. 1983 was a year with a lot of ups and downs, but it was a year that continued to showcase the fast growth of the gaming industry, as well as the fast increase in quality experienced in games, while also introducing different and innovative genres. Definitely. The innovation is happening, and mostly in the honorable mentions video, so like if you didn't see that, I would recommend that. Definitely some new stuff is being tried out, and I do appreciate that. On that note, I can't help but praise Dragon's Lair and Space Ace, games that cheated the system of game development to create an experience that far surpassed what most other games could offer, at the very least graphically, making them some of the more interesting games I've seen in the years covered so far. However, the realm of more normal games didn't slack off either, with the appearance of big names like Mario Brothers and Bomberman, both franchises that today are very well known, but whose origins are not as popular. So I found it very interesting to see them. We also saw the continuation of the big two of these early years, Wizardry and Ultima, and while Wizardry to me seemed to be able to stick to its formula and improve upon it, Ultima 3 left a lot to be desired. I feel as if they tried to add a lot to it, and though it was good in concept, the execution just seemed to fall apart a bit, losing some of the interest I had for the first two games. Yeah, pretty much stuff that we have talked about. I agree with most of this. There were also many other titles that impressed on their own, like the Star Wars arcade game, whose fast-paced action and first-person view managed to convey an authentic experience of the franchise to an astonishing degree of accuracy, especially for its time. Arkhan is definitely also one to mention, as its unique gameplay style set it apart from basically anything else on the market at the time, despite its poor balance. Others, like Tapper Crystal Castles, kept improving upon previous formulas. For a favorite, I'm undecided between Planetfall, due to the pure quality of text adventure games, or Track and Field, due to me being a big fan of seeing my improvement at games, which its precise measures allow for. But I believe Planetfall wins for me at the end. So yeah, pretty much what we have talked about. I swear I write my opinions before I read the opinions of other people here. But we end up having a lot of the same stuff. Track and Field, definitely one of those games that a lot of people liked at the time. And yeah, if you're a competitive guy, that's the one for you. If that's what interests you, you want to constantly get a little bit better or outcompete somebody else, Track and Field is probably going to be the best for you there. I've never been that kind of competitive guy, so it doesn't appeal to me, but if that appeals to you, Track and Field is the way to go. Mike Lindgren, a lot of interesting games in 1983. It's interesting to see the creativity of some of the developers as they try to make something unique and appealing. Not all the experiments worked out, but I really enjoyed the different arcade cabinet controls, from buttons to trackballs and beer taps. Looking forward to 1984. Yeah, arcades, they're trying to make things different because, it's pretty much the same thing every time you play. So let's try something different, right? Joe B., 1983 is a nice clean year, overshadowed by the big video game crash. Traditional consoles took a hit, but arcades and PCs kept chugging out good games. And a certain family computer was birthed in Japan that year, very slowly taking over the market there. It's not going to be that slow. Out of the games you played, my favorite would be Ultima 3, where we saw the most dangerous of enemies yet, deadly floors. Those floors, man. I'd also give a shout out to the Laserdisc based games. They might be quarter munchers, but they look so darn good doing it. And quick shout out to the Portopia serial murder case and the legacy it shaped. Yeah, the Portopia serial murder case is going to be very influential. I did almost make a video on that one. I wanted to, but then I decided that since the only version I could play came out like 7 years later, it just didn't feel right to do it. But it's only like a fan translation. It's a very interesting game, very influential in Japan, and we will continue to see people cite it as an influence. So absolutely. He continues, looking forward to 1984, though I think the crash affected 1984 hard, making it a slightly quieter year. Best of luck. We'll get to that pretty soon, actually. All right, let me switch back to my notes here. Yeah, we're going to just go straight ahead into looking ahead to 1984. Thank you to all the patrons that did contribute to this. We will hear from you again at the end of 1984, I am sure. All right, so let's look ahead to 1984. A little bit of teasers for you here. The first thing, if you look at 1984, there's some big and important and influential media in 1984. We'll talk about that in the Cultural World video that we start the year with. This year would help define a large portion of the 80s in film, television, and even comics. We're going to talk about some of these things, and we might have to delve into them because they are like cultural moments that are going to influence video games, even if it doesn't do it immediately. There's going to be other films that come out this year that we're going to talk about when we play a game that's kind of based on it. And I do have to kind of gauge which one of those I want to do. But 1984, if I remember right, there were like 3 films like in a row, back to back to back, all came out in the summer that we'll be talking about, and we'll be delving into those. Why'd my computer go blurry on me? I just looked down for a second. What are you doing? But yeah, there's also television shows that come out that we're probably not going to talk about until we play a game for it. And then comics, there's one in particular that stands out to me that we will definitely play games that are based on that, and we'll delve into the story when that happens. With the ongoing stuff, the TV shows and the comic books, where it's just not like this one day I can say, this one day we can talk about it. The story kind of evolves over time. Those are going to be a little bit harder for me to choose when we talk about it, but just know that they're there and they've started. All right, next up, 1984 is a huge turning point in the industry. Like I said, we have mostly been talking about the downfall of Atari to this point, but if spoilers, they wouldn't call it the video game crash of 1983 if Atari was the only one that got hit. Like some of the other guys are going to get hit too, right? Like it's going to happen. It's just going to take some time. In 1984, we're going to talk about that. There are some highs, right? There's some new stuff that comes out. There's a lot of highs. There's a lot of lows. And we'll just kind of talk about it. It's a turning point. Like a lot of crashes. They're not just, okay, it's over. It's, okay, now it has to evolve and turn to something else in order to survive. And we'll talk about that. Sports games. Sports games are going to get better. We talked a bit about it with track and field. That's going to kind of rejuvenate people's interest in sports games. Sports games have been there the whole time, right? We kind of briefly look at it like, you know, when a console is released, especially like the Intellivision or the Magnavox Odyssey 2, or even the Pong clones, technically those are sports games. Sports games are almost always there. And we just don't talk about it because nobody really cares that much about it. You basically have to release an American football game. You have to release a baseball game. Some people release a basketball game. But we don't talk about it because nobody really cares about those games. So that's going to change. Eventually, sports games are going to become more popular, and track and field is going to be an influence on that. And to the point that we might actually do a background video on a sport all by itself this next year. I don't want to say which sport it's going to be, but I will say that we might do a video talking about the history of that sport and the rules of that sport, and then play a game, possibly 2 games, based on that sport. So I know that there's kind of an idea in the industry that sports games are never good. I'm going to show you that that's not necessarily the case, hopefully. There are some good sports games out there, and they are worth talking about because of their importance and their influence. And some of them are really good games, and we'll get into that. But yeah, don't think that I'm just going to skip sports as a whole. There's not a genre that I'm specifically saying I will never play that game. It all depends on the game itself. So we are going to get back into that in 1984. Spoilers, there's going to be a sports game. Speaking of that, we will see more of a variety of game genres as a whole. There's one in particular that I have refused to mention the name of, but there's a lot of growing games in that genre, I would say. At this point, they don't have a name. They are games that require thinking, that require a bit of forethought, a bit of planning. I'm sure you guys have figured out what genre I'm talking about, but they don't have that name yet, so I can't name it that. I believe starting in 1984, 1985, I might actually be able to name it that. But I'm excited to see those grow. Like Arkhan would be considered one of them, Bokosuka Wars, obviously, Utopia and Mule. We'll see those. We'll also make a return to console games. 1983 is kind of an aberration that there's not a console game that we actually ended up covering. There were some honorable mentions that we talked about, lots of ports, but no official games. 1984, we're going to play some console games again. And that makes me happy. I don't want to see a platform die, you know what I mean? Maybe individual consoles themselves need to go at some point. Like, how much longer can we really be playing stuff on the Atari 2600? But the platform itself of consoles, I don't want to see that go away. And we will be playing some games on that. We'll also be seeing less ports, which we talked about, which is good for me. I don't like editing those like 10 to 20 second segments of the ports. It's one of my least favorite things to do. So seeing less of those is good for me, but they're important and I need to talk about it. Like I mentioned before, we'll also be splitting the honorable mentions videos because that just proved to be too much of a hassle to put one video together. I believe it took me about a week and a half and somewhere around 40 to 50 hours worth of work between the scripting, the recording, and the editing. Don't know if you guys heard that, but it's just a FedEx truck, it looked like. No barking at that. It took a while. It actually took 3 sessions just for me to finish recording it, which is something that has never happened before. It was because I had limited time on 2 of those days, but there was no way I could ever finish that in 1 day to record, and that is my standard. So definitely moving forward, we're going to be splitting them. The way that I've decided, at least for 1984, is to split it into quarters so that we can talk about some of the changes that happen and a little bit closer to when they actually happen. So if something happens in January, we'll talk about it at the end of the first quarter, kind of with March and all that. And yeah, there's a lot of stuff that still end up in the honorable mentions that are worth talking about. And we have quite a bit to talk about. And splitting it is going to be better because we can talk about some of the behind-the-scenes stuff a little bit earlier, and we can talk about why it's important. Probably need to keep an eye on Atari. That's the only one that I'll talk about right now. I don't believe there's anything that I need to talk about in particular with that. But anyway, we're going to split those. We're going to talk about some behind-the-scenes stuff. We're going to talk about some video games that got released, some ports, and we're going to talk about it, split out throughout the year. It'll make things easier for me and easier for you guys to digest. And then the videos will come out faster, right? And that's always good. Overall, we're going to have more videos in 1984 or at least more topics to talk about in 1984 than we did in 1983. Because, Wizardry 3 and Ultima 3 each, I think, took 11 videos. It's hard for me to say it's going to be more videos, but it's definitely going to be more topics. And there are, I believe, 1 or 2 games that I think are going to have to be split, but nothing like what we've been doing. So it might be about the same amount of videos overall. I'm just kind of looking down my list here. But it might be the same amount of videos, might be a little bit more, but overall there's going to be more things to talk about. 1984 is probably a more influential year than 1983 was, just as in culture as a whole, and that's something that we need to talk about. So once again, this video proved to be very, very long, and I do apologize for that, but that seems to be standard for these videos, and you guys knew it going in. You guys know, before I do, basically. At this point, I don't know how long this video is, but you guys did because you clicked the video. So we are going to Move on to 1984. I hope you guys do look forward to it. Like I said, lots of influential stuff going on, lots of ups, lots of downs, lots of changes going on. And we're going to have to talk about all of those. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and I hope you do look forward to 1984. Thanks for watching.